How long is eternity and a day? Well, it's about 2 hours and 17 minutes. This is an unabashed art film. It's a movie about a poet. So get your art film bingo card out because you're going to need it. Eternity and a Day was directed by Theodoros Angelopoulos. I'm not entirely sure how you say his name, but I am pretty sure that it came out in 1998 and pretty sure that it won the Golden Palm at Cannes. If there's one thing to know about Angelopoulos, it's that his movies don't move very fast. You'll need to set your attention span to high for this one, but don't get me wrong, Eternity and a Day is an incredible movie. This is a film that does something that only the absolute best movies do, or at least that only a handful of movies do. What is this? Well, this is a movie that goes beyond words. It expresses something that I'm not really going to be able to tell you. What a noble calling for a movie. What a high calling to share an idea, a thought, a feeling that is hard to share, maybe impossible to share any other way. This movie is about a writer/poet named Alexandros, played by Swiss actor Bruno Ganz. Alexandros seems to be approaching the end of his life, but aren't we all? Alexandros seems like he maybe has one more day before he reports to a hospital. It's not the first movie where Bruno Ganz may or may not be dying. I'd recommend the Wim Wenders film The American Friend if you're interested in that particular theme. That's a very different movie, but it's cool. This movie takes place over 24 hours, although it seems like maybe a lot longer than that. This one day somehow encompasses an entire lifetime. You can probably already pick up on some of the big themes. This is a movie about time, about memory, about life and death. Again, check off some boxes in your art film bingo, but I promise you this movie is not a pile of cliches. At first, you might pick up on a few tropes, though. Like I said, Alexandros is going through what seems like his final day. He starts out this day by moping, but before too long, he bumps into a young Albanian immigrant, seemingly an orphan. Get your art film bingo card ready again because this character is known simply as the Child. The Child was actually played by a real child, not only a real child, but a real Albanian immigrant. I'm not sure if you've looked at a map lately, but Albania is right next to Greece, and there are a ton of Albanian immigrants in Greece. This movie came out in 1998 when there were still wars in the Balkans. Greece has an interesting relationship with the rest of the Balkans, both cinematically and in real life. I don't know very much about real life, but I can touch on the other part. If you've only ever seen American movies about Greece, like The Guns of Navarone, or Mamma Mia, or even Zorba the Greek, which is mostly a Greek movie, you might not be aware, you might not even realize that Greece is in the Balkans. For whatever reason, I think Greece is much more legible to Americans than Albania or Macedonia. Those countries are smaller, I guess, but much more legible than really any other country in the Balkans. Maybe this is just because Greece was never behind the Iron Curtain. Even for me, when I think about Balkan movies, I think about Amir Kusturica, and that feels a bit different from a Greek movie, even though there's actually a lot of things in common. Maybe, again, it's the legacy of the Soviet Union, because so many of the Eastern European films are kind of defined by the traces of that government. I don't know. With Angelopoulos, though, there is always a sense of Greece in a broader geographic context, and I think that's cool. Here, we get that with these refugee stories. This is a movie that has undercurrents of social realism in it, but overall, it's not really that kind of movie. Once Alexandros and the boy meet up, the film starts to look a bit like a road movie. I think almost all of Angelopoulos' movies could be described as road movies, at least the ones I've seen. There are two things that make this particularly salient. First, this echoes some of the regional conflict that I just mentioned. It resonates with a feeling of displacement that I think is pretty common in the Balkans, not just in the 90s, but way before that too. You know, the word diaspora comes from Greek. Of course, a lot of words come from Greek, but that's still perhaps telling. Secondly, this idea of a journey, this idea of an odyssey, if you will, might remind us a bit of mythology. And I'm not just saying that because this is a Greek movie, but, you know, when you live in Greece, or if you just pass through, you are going to be surrounded by a lot of old stuff. Usually there's new stuff right next to the old stuff, just maybe a bit like a young child and an old man. It's conspicuous time is a conspicuous thing. What can I say? Seeing the new and the old, well, draw your own conclusions. It's not hard to see how this old and new idea might be related to aging, to life and death, to memory, and to myth. This movie kind of feels like a myth. If I cared more about Greek mythology, I might try to trace it to some particular story, overlay it onto the Odyssey, or I don't know, but I'm not going to do that. All of this stuff is kind of interesting, I think, but I don't think it's the point, really. This is an easy movie to write an essay about. There's a lot of formal things sticking out here and there, but these are not the things that make the movie great, that make it interesting. At least not to me. I was actually a bit bored in the beginning of the film. Of course, there are some nice ideas throughout. For instance, when Alexander is in his moping phase, he talks about how every day he plays a record on his stereo, and then a stranger in a building across the street responds by playing the same record. Alexander seems kind of disenchanted with his life at this point. He sort of stopped working. And this is an interesting relationship that he picks up. Is it, one glowing ember of the connections of the world, one reason to stay in the world, or is it another facet of ennui and superficiality? Let me say, by the way, that the music in this movie is incredible. The score of this film is amazing. It's one of these moments where you think that it's got to be like a famous classical piece because it sounds so amazing. You think this has got to be a super well known, but nope. Original score for this movie written by Eleni Karindaru. I don't know how to say her name. Listening to the score after I saw this movie, I found it so moving, and the music is going to be with me for a long time. If you don't want to watch the movie, at least listen to the music. Anyway, we have this record playing thing, this connection with the stranger. Interesting stuff. Before too long, we learn that the last thing that Alexandros was working on was trying to complete an ancient poem. Later on, we'll learn a bit more about this poet. It turns out he was a collector of words who traveled around trying to find new ones, who offered a reward to anyone who could give him a new word. Again, this is kind of neat, kind of a cute intellectual story. But for me, the movie didn't start until a bit later when we reach the border of Albania. Actually, I think we get to the border a little bit before some of those stories with the poet. But to me, the movie kicks off when we reach the Albanian border. I won't give you the details of exactly how and why we end up at the border. But this, I think, is where you first get a sense of why Angelopoulos is a great director. I think it's just one long shot. It's totally unconventional. It's surreal. But somehow it captures the anguish and the turmoil of national conflict, of displacement, of the erosion of the homeland, and of the fear of a young child. The scene almost seems like a nightmare. Almost seems like a nightmare, the fear of a child, but it's also tied up in this war and this conflict and displacement. It captures this better than most feature-length films, honestly, and it's just one shot. This, to me, is cinema at its finest. I think this is also where I started to understand the language of the movie. This is going to sound maybe kind of vague, but I think this is one of those movies that speaks its own language. Maybe like something you'd find in a Tarkovsky film, although I don't want to draw too deep of a comparison between these directors. There is something in common. The dramatic logic in this movie is not from planet Earth. Okay, yes, there's a little kid and an old guy, there's a poet, there are some traces of some tropes, but once the movie gets cooking, it's doing something totally different. And it's hard for me to describe this. The apex of this film is a scene on a bus. An old man and a young boy riding on a bus late at night. People get on and off. Some musicians get on the bus and play. For a moment, the music in this scene is, again, just incredible. You can maybe see how this might be a metaphor for life. You've probably ridden a bus, and it's interesting, seeing the people of the world, seeing your reflection on the glass, passing by the world, sort of locating, sort of dislocating. You sort of have agency, but you're not driving the bus. Man, a bus on a late night feels kind of, feels like life in some ways. Believe me, though, there's no way I can really do this scene justice, even if you can kind of pick up on how the metaphor might function. There's no way I can really describe it. It is incredibly beautiful and incredibly moving. I watched Eternity in a Day as part of a block of about 5 movies over the holidays this winter. And I watched some heavy hitters, some big, famous movies, and some sad movies. I watched Lust, Caution, directed by Ong Lee, for instance, an intense movie with a lot of emotional stuff in it. This movie was the only one that connected with me emotionally. The only one. And it was this scene on the bus that did it. Ostensibly, it's just a kid and an old guy riding on a bus. But man, this scene is so powerful. This scene alone, give him the golden palm for this scene alone. Or the scene on the border alone. Give him the golden palm. If at this point of the movie you're sitting there thinking, well, this is boring, then don't bother finishing it. In truth, this is not a very accessible movie, but if you get into it, it is so deep and so powerful. So what lessons does this movie have to offer about life and about time, about aging? Well, it isn't really that kind of movie. It's not a movie with lessons that I can give to you, that I can describe to you. I mean, it's a movie that I feel like taught me something immense, something incredible, but I don't know how to share it exactly. One image that we return to time and time again in this movie is the sea, the water. Maybe this isn't too surprising because there's a lot of water in Greece, I guess. We spend some time looking out at the ocean, and this, I think, clues you in a little bit to just the unflinching scope of the movie, right? The ocean is unfathomable. You know what I mean? It's the thing to look at and be overwhelmed by, like looking up at the night sky. And in some ways, I think this movie draws a bit of a line between that and time. And yeah, it's confronting the passage of time, the aging, and all this stuff. And one thing it offers us is that, yes, it is unfathomable, like the ocean. Believe me, that is just a slice. That's just a little sliver of the things that are going, the thing that's going on here. The movie starts with a quotation. Time is a child playing dice. Something like that. And at first, that doesn't make any sense. Time is a child playing dice? Huh? I mean, most people feel, if anything, if you should feel anything about time, you should feel regretful. And you might think that this movie would have a regretful tone, that it would be a sad movie about death, about aging. It isn't. This movie is profoundly ambivalent about the passage of time, which is amazing and so poignant. Time is a child playing dice. By the time the movie ends, you're going to understand that quotation, and you're going to realize how deeply true that is. This is, as you can probably see, I mean, it's an incredible. It's a great movie. I guess if there's one thing I would critique, maybe, well, not every part of the movie really stuck out to me. I mentioned already that I was sort of bored in the beginning, and certainly there were parts that I felt like, okay, maybe this could be cut out. There's a wedding scene or something like that. I think that probably this is not so much a flaw of the director as a flaw of me. I mean, how often do I say this? If there's anything I didn't like, it's probably my fault. That's how much I like this movie, right? Most likely, these other scenes, if I came back to them at some other point in my life, I feel like they would have something else to teach me that I just didn't get this time around. It's hard to say a bad word about this incredible film. That's Eternity and a Day. If you've seen it, I'd be really curious what you think about this movie. Like I said, I'm struggling to really say much about it, it feels like, in some ways. If there's something you think can be said, let me know. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out, because it's truly an astoundingly good movie.